Brief, your client is London Zoo. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the conservation work specifically that we do in our conservation zoos. So as I said before, we have over 20,000 animals across the two zoos. It's pretty much evenly split. There's about 10,000 at each, but a lot of those animals at London are a lot smaller. So that includes a lot of invertebrates and amphibians and birds. We do have some mammals, but there's not as many of the big mammals that you would find over at Whipsnade. And this includes, of these different animals, we actually help support 206 different breeding programs. 170 of the species or subspecies that live in our two zoos are threatened with extinction. 16 of those species are actually extinct in the wild, and we'll talk about that a little bit more today. And over 90 of the species are edge, which again is something I'm going to talk about. It's just a way of us identifying some of those species that are most at risk and need protecting. Now, when we're talking about breeding programs, those words get used quite a lot when we're talking about zoos. So I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what that means and why we have these breeding programs. So if you like, breeding programs are kind of like the safety net, if you like. It's about having a viable population of a particular species so that eventually they can be released back into the wild. Now, breeding programs, the reasons why animals are becoming endangered or becoming extinct varies, as we talked about before. It could be habitat loss, it could be trade, it could be disease. The breeding program has to happen in conjunction with conservation work that's happening out in the field as well, to make sure that once you have this viable population, you're also working to protect that habitat, that ecosystem in which that species lives, so that you can reintroduce them back into the wild in the future. Now, for a lot of species, that might not be possible yet. A lot of their threats still exist, and if you put them back into the wild now, it's not going to help save that species. But for some species, we are at that point where we're able to reintroduce them back into the wild. So I wanted to talk through a few examples of species that you might want to feature in your artwork, and that you can see here at the zoo today when you go and do your research. So some of the species are what we call extinct in the wild.
Doesn't always mean lost forever. Extinct in the wild species have vanished from their natural homes, but still swim, sway, and hold on tight in the expert care of conservation zoos, aquariums, and botanical gardens. These are the world's most threatened species, and their survival is entirely in our hands. Together, our science-driven conservation organisations can give them another chance, a life beyond extinction. We rescue and care for last survivors, working closely with governments, NGOs, and research institutes. We share their stories. We revitalise their populations through coordinated breeding programs. Working with local partners, we carefully release or plant them back into safe wild habitats. And even when they've settled back into nature, we stay in touch, ensuring their wild populations are reinforced long into the future. This mission requires a huge, united effort, but we know it works. That's why a new alliance to champion extinct in the wild conservation has been forged. Join us, share your skills, knowledge, or resources, and together we'll fight for the recovery of every single one of these precious species. Let's give extinct in the wild species a second chance. Extinction doesn't have to be an end. It can be a new beginning.
So I think what this kind of highlights is that, well, one, a lot of people think once an animal is extinct, that's it, gone forever. But there's two different categories of extinct. So there is extinct in its entirety, which means things like the dodo, they are gone forever, we can't get them back. But then we do have species that are called extinct in the wild, which means that they can exist in captive populations such as in zoos. And so ZSL is part of a newly forged alliance called the Extinct in the Wild Action Partnership. And this really highlights that we can't do it alone. Everything works better when you're part of a team, right? So it's actually about working with other organisations to harness all of those strengths of those different organisations to be able to really make the biggest impact. So one of the species in which we are working to reintroduce back into the wild because it has been extinct for a number of years now is the Socorro dove. Anyone heard of the Socorro dove before? No. And that's another thing to highlight. A lot of these species I wanted to highlight to you today are ones that maybe are less familiar, because there are some incredible animals out there that people have just never heard of before and don't know their stories. So art is a really great way to be able to bring these animals to the forefront. A lot of people have heard of gorillas and tigers and pandas and all of those kind of big animals, elephants. Art is often a really interesting way to be able to reach people and highlight the stories of those who perhaps haven't had a spotlight shone on them before. So you'll notice a lot of the examples I'm going to give today are quite unusual ones. So the Socorro dove is extinct in the wild. It was last seen in the wild in 1971. And it was declared extinct in the wild in 1972. So it's only found on one island. It's called the Socorro Island, which is near Mexico, hence its name. And about 100 years ago, 17 Socorro doves were taken from the wild and put into the care of conservation zoos back in the 1920s. So a very long time ago that people realised that there was actually a problem with this particular species. There's now 189 living across 46 different zoos around the world. So if you think all of those 189 all come from those 14 individuals. We have 9 of those individuals here at London Zoo, including a few little babies. This was one of our babies that was born last year. It's got a little, you can see it's got a little ZSL tag on its leg. And we just had 3 individuals that moved across from a zoo in Portugal last year. And that's really important, that zoos can work together to move animals across to different zoos and to move them to new homes and to meet new families. Why do you think that might be important? Why wouldn't we just, okay.
So that they can breed more.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important, if you think if we just had the animals that lived here and they didn't move anywhere else, very soon they're all going to be related to each other and very closely related to each other. And so we need to make sure that we're moving the animals across so that we're spreading that gene pool and maximising the diversity of that gene pool as much as we can. It can be quite difficult with populations that start very, very small. So we have to work really, really hard to maximise the diversity of those individuals. And the plan actually for the Socorro dove with a number of other organisations is to be able to reintroduce these species back into the wild in 2030. So one of the main reasons that these animals became extinct, well there was 2. So one was when humans moved to the Socorro Island and the other surrounding islands, they brought with them cats. What do cats like to eat or chase or hunt?
Mouse.
Yeah.
And rats.
And rats. And what else might they try and catch?
Oh,
birds. Absolutely. So they were. The cats weren't just living in people's homes; they were going out. They became. There's now there was quite a large feral cat population. The other issue on this particular island was that a lot of habitat was cleared for farmland. There's a lot of grazing cattle, and so that was removing the habitat that these birds needed. So it's not just enough for us to just breed these birds and release them back into the wild. That has to happen at the same time that the conservation work is happening to remove the threats that made that species extinct or critically endangered in the first place. So alongside that work that's happening in Mexico, or in the Socorro Island, we've got this work happening in the zoos, and together that will save this particular species. Another one of my favourites is these little guys, who are a group of species called the partula snail. They're quite small, so they're about the size of your little fingernail. So if you have a look at your little fingernail, most of them don't get much bigger than that. And there are dozens of partula snail species that live in Polynesia, but a number of them now are extinct in the wild. And one of the reasons that they became extinct in the wild is because of another snail, or more specifically because us humans put another snail in there, introduced another snail into Polynesia. And that snail was the giant African land snail. Has anyone ever seen a giant African land snail? Yeah? They can be like the size of your hand. And the giant African land snails were taken to Polynesia because they thought they might be a good food source. They can be farmed very easily. They're a high source of protein. So it was kind of back in, I think it was about the 60s. And it was meant to be like a good thing to help people. But actually what happened is a lot of the snails escaped from these farms. And what do you reckon snails quite like to eat? Leaves, absolutely. So although the snails were introduced as to try and help with food, what they actually ended up doing was decimating all of the farms and the crops and made the problem much worse in Polynesia. So humans trying to help actually made the problem much worse. And also because they were then introduced, so we're like, well, what are we going to do with all of these massive snails that are just decimating all of our crops? Anyone know what they thought they might do?
Eat them?
No, but they did think they would introduce something that might eat them. What do you think might eat a giant African land snail?
Us.
That's not us. Is
Is,
that
Birds?
good guess? It wasn't a bird.
too big.
Is it a feline?
It wasn't a feline, but good guess. It was actually another snail.
What?
Yes. So they introduced another snail because some snails are carnivorous. Not all snails eat leaves and vegetation. They actually introduced the rosy wolf snail, which whilst it has a lovely name, the rosy wolf snail, it's actually a predatory snail and it eats other snails. It's quite a slow kind of attack. It's not quite like what you would see on a David Attenborough maybe, but they hunt other snails by following the snail trails of other snails. But this didn't quite go to plan because you've got these giant African land snails that are about this big, right? A rosy wolf snail is about this big. What else might be living in Polynesia that might be a tasty snack for a predatory snail that's about this big?
Another one?
Yeah,
No snail.
yeah. What snail do you think? What one did we talk about at the beginning?
The African snail.
The one that lived there? The partula, yes. So the partula snails to the rosy wolf snail are a lovely bite-sized snack because they're only the size of our little fingernail. So if you're a predatory snail, you're more likely to go for this cute little tasty snail as opposed to the massive giant African land snails are far too big for you to eat. So unfortunately, whilst again trying to help, humans actually made the problem worse. And so they introduced another snail that didn't get rid of the giant African land snails, but instead decimated the population of partula snails, which were there in the first place before the humans got involved. And so thankfully, at the time that this was happening, scientists were studying these snails and started to notice a huge decline in the different species of partula snail. And so an intervention was staged about 40 years ago, 50 years ago maybe now. And so there was a coordinated conservation effort to take some of these snails and put them into the safety of captive breeding programs so that they had a bit of time to try and work out a solution to this problem before the partula snails went extinct. And so over the last 40 years, ZSL and a number of different organisations, this is by no means us doing it alone, a number of different organisations have been breeding these snails And in the last 10 years alone, around 30,000 have been released. So as well as breeding the snails in zoos and other places, there's been a lot of work happening in Polynesia to help restore that habitat, remove those invasive species like the rosy wolf, and so that when they are released, they're released into a safe habitat. And even in the last year, we released 6,000 snails that were bred here and in other zoos across 10 different species. And we've actually found evidence now that these snails are breeding in the wild. So what happens is, before the snails go back into the wild, they're all given a little mark on their shell. So basically like a little drop of nail varnish on the back of their shell. Doesn't do them any harm, but what that tells us is when we go back each year, we can see the coloured snail, so the colour of the dot, to know what year it was released and if it was one that was born in a zoo. And what we're actually finding now is that there are snails there that don't have a mark on them. So what does that tell us?
They're newborns?
Yes, exactly. So that there are now these snails that are breeding in the wild, and they are actually now back to being snails in the wild. So they have actually, some of these species have now been downgraded from extinct in the wild to critically endangered. So there's still not that many of them left, but it's much better. The problem is they are now back as an established species. And actually when we're done here, if you want to go and see them, so you can see, I should have said, the Socorro doves you can see in the Blackburn Pavilion later if you want to go and see them. The Partula snails you can see literally just over the road to where we are now in Tiny Giants. Just on the left-hand side is their breeding area. So you'll be able to see all of those snails before they go back into the wild. So some of the species we are protecting are, as I said, extinct in the wild species. Other species I mentioned earlier are edge species. So this is another project that ZSL is working on with colleagues to protect, identifying what is most at risk of going extinct. And so EDGE basically means, it's an acronym for evolutionarily distinct and globally endangered. So what that means is these species are unique, and if they go extinct, nothing else exists like them. So we've lost this whole type of animal. So it's just, as I say, another way of identifying. But basically these are animals that are unique in the way that they look, live, behave, and when they're gone, nothing else will be like them. So they're basically like the most weird and wonderful animals that exist on Earth. Does anyone know what this animal is? No? You can see them here at the zoo today. They are into Africa. They are the okapi. Now, has anyone heard of a giraffe before?
Yeah.
Yes. This is the giraffe's closest living relative. A lot of people, when you ask them what the closest living relative is, they think zebra because they've got stripy legs. So all they see is the stripy legs and they can't see past that. They've got kind of, they're on four legs, they're stripy, must be a zebra, right? They're not. They are, as I say, they're most closely related to the giraffe. And when you look at their head shape, I would really recommend going and having a look at the giraffes and then having a look at the okapis. They're just next door to each other. Their head shape is exactly the same. They've also got the dark coloured tongue. Does anyone know why giraffes and okapis have a dark coloured tongue? No? It's to stop it getting sunburn. So giraffes and okapis, they use their tongues to collect leaves from the trees. So the darker colour is just to protect them and stops them from getting their tongue sunburned, which I think is pretty cool. And it's prehensile, which means basically it acts like a finger. So they can pick the leaves with their tongue to pull them off of the trees, which is pretty cool. But these, as I say, they are the most closely living relative. Why do you think they don't have the long neck? Why does a giraffe have a long neck? What's the sort of evolutionary advantage of having a long neck?
Well, giraffes have long necks, so they could manage to eat the leaves from the highest trees. Absolutely,
right? So giraffes live in savanna habitats, so they've evolved to reach leaves that other animals can't reach, right? Because there's a lot of animals in the savanna, they need that advantage. The long neck gives them that advantage. These guys, the okapis, they live in rainforest habitats. So having a long neck would be a huge disadvantage for an okapi because it would get in the way when you're trying to navigate through the rainforest. So they live in a much denser habitat. They don't need that long neck. So they've got a much shorter neck, but they still have that prehensile tongue to be able to get the leaves off of the trees. And they're very, very cool. So definitely worth having a look at. So part of our work through the EDGE program is identifying these species that are really unusual and working to protect them. And we do that in lots of different ways. So one of the ways we do this is through our EDGE Fellows program. So this is with working with in-country conservationists to protect their species. So these fellows live all across the world, and they live and work in the countries where these species are naturally found. And our EDGE Fellowship program is connecting them. It's like a mentorship program, if you like. So it's connecting them to other conservationists to really help set them up to succeed and protect these species. And we also, as I say before, do the breeding programs for them. So, so far we've supported 145 different EDGE Fellows working on 141 species in 47 different countries across the world. So I would really recommend having a look for some EDGE species. They're really, really cool, unusual ones. One is the okapi. Another one is the mountain chicken. Anyone want to take a guess at what type of animal you think a mountain chicken might be? You have it, shout it out if you like. Anyone heard of a mountain chicken before?
Well, you said mountain chicken, right?
Yeah.
So like another type of bird?
Another type of bird? Who else thinks it might be a type of bird?
I mean, based on
It makes sense. It's actually, you'd think it's a bird, right? It's called a mountain chicken. It's actually a frog. It's a really, really big frog, but it is a frog. It's called mountain chicken. It's not actually its real name. It's kind of a sort of a name it's been given because it lives up in the mountains and apparently it tastes like chicken. So it got called mountain chicken. But don't let that put you off. They're a massive, massive species of frog. This is just to give you a ratio, human to frog ratio here. They usually weigh around about as much as like a tin of beans or a tin of soup, but they can weigh up to 1 kilogram. And they can jump up to 2 meters. So that is about the height of this room. So these frogs can jump about 2 meters in height, which I think is pretty cool because they have quite long legs. But they are one of the largest frogs in the world, and they are currently critically endangered. They're not quite extinct in the wild yet, but there are only thought to be about 21 of them now left. And their biggest threat is disease, and in particular it's a type of fungus called the chytrid fungus. And it basically kind of exists on the skin of frogs. And I don't know how familiar everyone here is with like frog life cycles, but frogs breathe not just through lungs, but also can breathe through their skin. They're amphibious, which means they live in water and on land. And so this fungus gets on the skin and it really affects how much they can take up oxygen. Basically, it kills them. And it's incredibly, incredibly contagious because all that needs to happen is if you've got a little bit of that fungus on your feet and you're walking through one bit of the forest and you walk through another bit of the forest, that fungus is being spread. If the frogs have got it on the skin and they're moving from place to place or coming into contact with other frogs, they're spreading this fungus. And it's thought to have wiped out, in the last few decades alone, more than 90% of this species. And chytrid is found all over the world. It's also found in the UK. It's also affecting British amphibians and reptiles as well. So it's a big, big problem that we're trying to collectively solve. But because it's such a big problem and because these numbers are decreasing so rapidly, the Mountain Chicken Recovery Program, which is a really catchy name, was set up in 2002 to, again, help protect this species and help to have a genetically viable population in captivity so that these animals can eventually go back into the wild. And we had 6 froglets born last year, which we were very, very excited about. You can see our wonderful mountain chickens in The Secret Life of Reptiles and Amphibians, but not just them. There are lots of different edge species in there. There are loads of weird and wonderful amphibians and reptiles. So I would really recommend taking a look there to see some of the really cool edge species that we have. The last one that I just wanted to talk about, because I'm very conscious that we've talked a lot about species that are living in lots of different countries all over the world. The UK is also is one of the most decimated countries in the world in terms of nature. It's one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. We are also therefore doing a lot of UK conservation as well. This species you can't actually see in the zoo, but I wanted to highlight them to show that these breeding programs aren't just about us, as I say, doing work in other countries. The UK is very much a target country for us as well for this conservation work. In this particular project, our role is not to do the breeding with the dormice. We work with different partners. Our role in this is actually to do the health checks of the dormice before they go back into the wild. So we have an incredibly qualified team of vets who work for ZSL, and they do what's known as like the disease risk management, if you like, because what we don't want to do is when we're putting animals back into the wild is to do more harm than good. Like you think back to the poor partridge snails where we all think we're doing something nice and actually make the problem worse. And a big problem for when you're reintroducing animals back into the wild is if they've spent time with humans in a captive setting, they might have a disease that they could accidentally give to others. So they come here and they stay in quarantine for 10 weeks just to make sure that they don't have any diseases that they can pass on to the wild dormice. We also give them a little health check, make sure that they're a healthy weight so that when they go back, they're actually fit and ready to go back into the wild to give them that best chance of success. So there's lots of different ways in which we work. And as you go around the zoo today, you'll see loads and loads of different examples. This is just a bit of a whistle-stop tour of some of them. And then I just wanted to finish up by talking about the other side of what our zoos do, which is bringing people closer to the natural world and enabling them to really have, hopefully, those emotional connections with species and feel like they want to do something about it. And we get over 2 million visitors to our zoos every year. So this is a really important opportunity for us to inspire these people, inform them of the problems, and empower them to do something about it. And so we do lots of different ways in which we do this. So it's not just the tickets into the zoo, like the general visitors. We have 140,000 educational visitors every year. We also work with a lot of community partners as well, and we run different schemes to make sure that we're reducing the barriers for people, financial or otherwise, to be able to access our zoos. And we want to create change in these visitors. And the reason I'm telling you all of this, not just to kind of help inform you as well, but is in that art that you create, we want you to be able to inspire this change in them. So there's 3 things that we ask people to do. We ask them to tread lightly on the planet, take action for wildlife, or help us to do more. Does anyone know what we think we mean by like treading lightly on the planet? What does that mean, do you think? Yep.
I swear we leave behind carbon prints or something like that, or emissions. So just to be careful with how much you're releasing.
Exactly. That's it. It's that kind of reduce, reuse, recycle kind of messaging. So everybody makes an impact on the planet. Everything we do makes an impact in some way. And so it's about minimizing that impact. That might be through reducing plastic use, that might be through reducing our carbon emissions by driving less or flying less, eating less red meat, etc., etc. The other things that we can do is we can actually, that's minimizing the harm, but then we can also maximize the good. So that's where taking action for wildlife is really good. That might be through things like setting up bird feeders, or planting wildflowers, or going out and helping organisations to plant trees. Those kind of things are actually like making space for wildlife. And the third one that we ask is to help us to do more. So that's through supporting organisations like ZSL. That might be through visiting us, through financial contributions, or through volunteering. We actually have just at the zoo alone, we had over 980 volunteers last year donating over 138,000 hours of their time to help us, which was really great. And as I say, this is about bringing people closer to wildlife. And so before you go, I'm going to give everybody a map with some signposts of not only where some of the species are found that we've talked about today, but also through some of those habitats that we hope help to inspire people and bring them closer. And in particular, one of the things I wanted to talk about is a concept called nature connectedness. Has anyone heard of nature connectedness as a concept before? Apart from Helen, because I talk about it a lot. And it's basically, it's a psychological construct. So it's about like how much someone feels part of nature and how much someone feels separate from it. So if you imagine it like a Venn diagram, if you like here's nature, here's you. Do you think like those 2 circles are completely overlapping, or do you think like, is it across here? Like there's nature over there and there's me and my human world existing over here. Now the reason I wanted to talk about this is because there's been a lot of science about why nature connectedness is really important. And actually what we found is the more that someone feels connected to nature, there's actually a lot of correlations with individual well-being as well. So people are more likely to, if you answer sort of certain questions, it helps understand like someone's life satisfaction or their happiness based on how they answer certain questions and their own well-being. And it's found that the more connected you are to nature, the higher, you're more likely to have higher well-being, higher happiness scores, higher life satisfaction index scores, greater meaning and purpose in life. So, and also, the more connected to nature you are, also shows the more likely you are to do those positive actions to protect wildlife as well. So it's a really important thing for us to consider is how do we connect ourselves as individuals to the natural world, but also in our work, whether it's through science or through art, how do we help other people to connect to the natural world too? And I'm a scientist by nature, so I like the science in it. There's been a lot of scientific research that has found there's 5 ways in which you can help someone to purposefully connect with nature. Now, connecting with nature is different from contact with nature. So it's not enough just to be in a space that's surrounded by nature. It's about kind of, I guess, being intentional with that, like noticing it, being part of it, seeing, hearing, and immersing yourself in it. So the reason that I wanted to highlight this is I'm not an artist in any way, shape or form, but art is definitely being proven to be one of the ways in which we can help people to connect with nature. So what I'm really interested in a group of artists in this room, is to see what your take is on how we use these nature connectedness pathways to help our visitors to connect. So there are 5 pathways: the senses, beauty, emotion, meaning, and compassion. So the senses is about really noticing what we see, hear, smell, feel, taste. So really being in nature and sort of feeling all of those different senses, and paying attention to what we're experiencing. So how can your art help people to pay attention to the natural world? The other way is through beauty. And I think this is probably where the obvious one with art comes in. It's about noticing, appreciating, and celebrating the beauty of nature. And a lot of the research says that art-based activities can often support this. So anything that your art can do to help celebrate the beauty of nature will help people to feel more connected to it. The third pathway is through emotions. So it's not just about being in nature, but it's also seeking, noticing, and reflecting on those different emotions like awe, wonder, joy, calmness, or delight when we're around nature. And becoming aware of these positive emotions and how we feel when we're in nature. So again, how might your art encourage these emotions in the people who are looking at it? And the reason I highlight this, in particular around the positive emotions, is it's often negative emotions are sometimes used when we're talking about the state of the planet, the problems that are being faced. And there's a lot of research that actually sometimes by highlighting all the negatives, that might not be influencing people to act positively. So there's a lot of research now that says if we can focus on the positives, that will help people to connect. The fourth one is around meaning. So exploring what nature means to us through our own personal and cultural stories. And again, through the arts, through language, through literature, these are really, really good ways to help invoke this meaning pathway. And the final one is compassion. So seeking opportunities to look after or protect nature helps people feel more connected to it. And if you think about that in a practical sense, if someone has helped to plant a lot of trees, they are going to feel more compassionate for those trees, they're more invested in that. But how perhaps could your art help to invoke that feeling of compassion? So just then, before Anne has just walked in, which is great, and perfect timing, before I hand over to Anne, just thinking about all of the things that we've talked about, how can you, as the artists in the room, your brief is to pick one or more of the species at London Zoo to help others to connect with the natural world through these species, using those nature connectedness pathways with that goal of inspiring, informing and empowering them to want to take action to protect them. So that's the brief. It's not an easy one. But you will have your tutors on hand to help you throughout the semester. And Helen and I will be here at the end as well, and Anne, if you've got any particular questions. I am going to hand over in a minute to Anne, but I have got a few minutes left over to give us a little bit of a break between the talks. Did anyone, firstly, if anyone wants to nip to the loo, you're very welcome to. They're just out to the left, and Helen will point you in the right direction. But did anyone have any questions about anything else we've talked about as well, just to give everybody a bit of a brain break?
I'm not sure if it's related, but does